Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to another Dr. Myrna Minute. As we wait for some more persons to jump on, I'm listening to A Strong Storm by the Chicago Mass Choir. He was there through the stormy rain, yeah. The storm and rain, I made it through heartaches and pain. Oh. Thank you for tuning in. Heartaches and pain, I made it. We're just waiting for a few more folks to jump on in. I lost loved ones, and when the doctor said it could be done, I had to stand on his word. My life was still in pain. I didn't know what step to take. I called on the Lord. He answered my prayer through the storm. Yeah. We're just gonna give it about another minute. Through heartaches and pain, through heartaches and pain. Yeah. Heartaches and pain, I made it through the storm and rain, yeah. The storm and rain, I made it through heartaches and pain, oh. Heartaches and pain, I made it. Thank God we made it. No matter what, we still here, we still standing. Praise God. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. Through the storm, as we conclude our series on emotional scarring, this evening we will look at strengthening. Let us go to the throne of grace. Eternal God, our refuge and our strong tower, our deliverer and our liberator. We gather into community to thank you, dear God. Thank you for sustaining us. Thank you for strengthening us. Thank you for keeping us through the emotional scarring. God, we thank you for your covering. We thank you for allowing us to still have our right mind. We thank you for the ability to continue to get up and to move forward. God, we thank you for creating safe and sacred spaces where we can come to you and lament. For you are the God that's able to hold all that we bring to you, and for that we say thank you. God, we pray that you'll continue to lead, continue to guide us in the path that you will have us to go. And we will forever give you all the glory and all the praise. In your Son, Jesus the Christ's name, we pray. Amen. Again, I want to thank you for tuning in, as this is our last Friday discussing emotional scarring. And we've learned a lot. And so when we know what we've learned so far about scars, is its structure, condition and causes, avoiding, reauthoring, and strengthening. And strengthening is what we will be highlighting on tonight. So when we think about strengthening, I want you to think of it in terms of shifting. You shift how you begin to see and view the scarring so that the scarring no longer has the same meaning that it once held. Strengthening focuses on your self determination to reauthor your story to create a new narrative rather than continuing to live out of the trauma or the emotional scarring. You choose to live a new narrative, one that's built and decided upon for your life by you and not the pain and the trauma or the emotional scarring of your past that may have been perpetrated against you by someone else. So, strengthening it shifts and reframes your focus from victim to victorious and consists of what I call four elements. The first one is a healthy psychological functioning. The second one is the emotional availability and vulnerability. The third is resiliency. And fourth, which we covered on last Friday, is reauthoring, which is the shift. Put your thoughts in the chat as it relates to all that you have learned from this series, especially if you've been present since the beginning. So, when we look at psychological functioning, it is the ability to achieve goals within the self and external environment. So, you achieve the goals through yourself as well as healthy environments that you have been in. So, psychological functioning looks at your emotional health, your ability to cope, your ability to express your feelings and your thoughts, your ability to enter into healthy relational situations, to have a healthy social outlook. When you process your emotional scars, you're able to choose to enter into healthy relationships because what happens is you're not focused on trying to please or focus on trying to be numb or focus on anything that's shifted or geared around pleasing someone else. The shift is you begin to know who you are. You begin to know what you desire, what you want, and what you deserve. And so when that happens, your mindset changes, what you desire changes, and you realize what you want, right? And so you desire to be in relationships that are healthy, that are life giving. It allows you to form a view of a healthy self. So you no longer see yourself in a fragmented sense, but you learn to see yourself in a cohesive sense, a sense that's victorious rather than victim. And so when you begin to build these healthy relationships, you shift from the two extremes, right? The first extreme is avoiding and isolation, and the second is pleasing or seeking to fit in. So when you enter into the shifting phase, the strengthening phase of healing from your emotional scars, you're no longer seeking to fit in. You're no longer seeking to please other people, and you are no longer to self isolate or to avoid, right? So you begin to name and you begin to declare your worth and your value. You said it. And that's the shift. No one else is setting your value and your worth for you. So you are able to create healthy boundaries and that permit you to be able to make healthy decisions and enter into a healthy place with yourself, therefore inviting other people to enter into a healthy place with you. The ability to process your needs and to show up for yourself. Because previously, when we're living in a state where we are living through the lens of the emotional scarring, of the trauma, it's not about us. We seek to find satisfaction in pleasing other people. And the shift here is we're no longer doing that. We know what we want and we seek to find pleasure within us. We seek to please ourselves because we love ourselves. We value ourselves. So, how we see ourselves, the lens in which we see ourselves shift, right? Because we're moving from victim to victorious. We're moving from a fractured state to a cohesive state. We know who we are, right? We know who we want to become, and we begin to walk in it, which allows us to build a healthy self esteem, right? Because sometimes, how many of us know when we have low self esteem? That's when we tend to accept anything. That's when we seek to please other people and don't really put our needs or what we need first, right? And when we are in a place where everyone else is more important than us, I just want to challenge us to be able to look at that, right? Because you matter. You matter and you are valuable and you deserve the very best. And when we shift in this phase, we learn how to honor what we feel. We know how to, or we learn how to honor what we think, right? And this allows us not to put everyone else's needs above our own. And it builds and strengthens the self, thereby building a healthy self image of the self and allows us to enter into healthy relationships. The second one is emotional availability and vulnerability. This has to do with our ability to cope, to develop healthy coping skills, to be able to deal with, to be able to process our emotions. You are able and capable of sustaining and building healthy emotional connections, right, with yourself and others. This helps you to build lasting relationships because you move from a place of isolation and armored and guardedness to a place of investment. You begin to invest in yourself. You begin to consider what it is that you need, what it is that you want, and what it is that you desire. This willingness to feel and to connect with you allows you to connect with others. And so you become open and you become vulnerable, first with yourself and then with others. You don't enter into relationships from a place of fear or out of a need for someone else to fill the void or the emptiness inside of you, right? You become emotionally, physically, and spiritually healthy, and therefore you're able to connect on a different level, right? Because you begin to know how to trust yourself. You trust yourself and you honor yourself, what you feel and what you think, right? And then you're open to pursue it. You're open to pursue what it is that you desire to have for your life rather than living to please other people or trying to fit in, right? And so your emotional quality of your involvement, when you process your emotional scars, they don't have power over you any longer. That's a shift, right? Because they're not controlling you. They're not controlling the type of relationships that you enter into, right? They're not controlling how you view and see yourself, right? So the shift is that once you begin the healing process, you begin to know who you are. You begin to express and lament what you feel and process your feelings and explore the who am I, right? The who am I, being able to answer that question for yourself and then learn how to give yourself what it is that you need. You have processed your emotions, and your emotional scarring no longer defines who you are, right? And that's important because we don't want to define ourselves through the emotional scarring because those are experiences, right? They are not our identity, they are experiences, right? And so you begin to develop a sense of self awareness. You recognize your emotions. And so when your emotions are stirred within you, you're able to have more awareness of that emotion and where that emotion is stemming from. And so that doesn't allow you to lead with the emotion. Rather, it allows you to acknowledge it and process it so you can move forward, right? Because before we learned that we live in a state of trying to be numb, or we try to please everybody to fill the void or the emptiness inside of us, right? And this is different because we're no longer doing that. We are in a state of self awareness. And so let's say that we do have a flashback and something comes up, we're able to acknowledge the pain, acknowledge whatever that is that comes up for us, and process it, right? Honor what we feel in that moment rather than using external things to become numb or to forget or to suppress. right? You give yourself permission to feel, you give yourself permission to acknowledge, and you give yourself permission to process it and move forward. You embrace your humanness and you offer yourself grace rather than living under a false narrative perpetrated on you by someone else. However, you recognize that you are good enough and you recognize for yourself what it is that you desire for you, and you begin to live in that and embrace that, because you no longer operate from a place of armoring and mask wearing, but rather you operate from a place of liberation and being liberated in your mind and how you think and how you view and perceive yourself, right? And so the next number three is resiliency. You explore how you have developed and how you have survived these emotional scars, examining the positive, right? What tools that you have in place, what tools were in your storehouse is the reason why you're still here. What are some innate things that you held on to that allowed you to get to this place, right? Rather than sinking into full despair, right? The fact that you are still standing, the fact that you are still pushing through, the fact that you're continuing to get up and push forward and move forward demonstrates innately that there is something within you that has allowed you to continue to move forward and not to allow the trauma, not to allow the emotional scarring to completely take you out. And so you focus on what tools or mechanisms you've been using to survive and get you to this place. But the shift is, so if you were using negative things to cope, right, you shift to completely using positive outlook, positive talk, and begin to reframe a positive identity for yourself. So when we think positively, it impacts our outview and our perspective. And number four is reauthoring. Remember, reauthoring helps us to acknowledge, to process, and to reframe the narrative where we can explore the trauma, the pain, the hurt, right? Whatever your emotional scarring is for you, you begin to reauthor it, right? You state what you desire and what you want out of your life, because this is your life. No one else can live it for you, right? No one else can dictate to you who you are. And part of the liberation is and the freedom is being able to acknowledge and process and give yourself permission to be, to become, to state and identify with who you are, right? Who has God created you to be before the emotional scarring, right? Who did God say that you are? And so through the process, you are no longer bound. You are no longer bound. You are no longer shackled by the experiences that cause the emotional scarring. Rather, you're on your healing journey of freedom and liberation, because how you view the pain, how you view the emotional scarring has shifted, right? Yes, this was painful, but I am more than this. Yes, this happened to me, but it does not define me. So and so no longer has power and control over me. I'm taking back my power. I'm taking back my control, and I'm no longer living in a state of fear. I'm no longer living in a state of isolation. I'm no longer living in a state of numbness and avoidance, rather, but I'm empowering myself. And I'm saying who I am and who I desire to be. And that's the path I'm going on. But you get to this once you've processed the pain, once you've lamented, once you've cried out, once you've expressed and acknowledged, right? Whatever the emotional scarring is for yourself. And so reauthoring helps us to acknowledge and to give voice to and honor our pain, because no matter what you feel, those are your feelings and you should honor them, right? You don't have to suppress them. You don't have to hide them, and you don't have to deny them, right? And you process them. And so it's not that the trauma or the emotional scarring ever goes away. You learn how to cope better with them. You learn how to develop healthy coping skills. So when they arise again, you know how to acknowledge, you know how to process, and you know how to create space for yourself to be able to deal with what comes up. So, reauthoring gives you permission to regulate your emotional response. It gives you permission to unpack the weightedness of your story, the weightedness of your scarring, right? And you begin to process it. Reauthoring helps your identity because it shifts what you've defined yourself from the trauma or the emotional scarring, and you begin to write a new narrative for yourself, right? And so it shifts your relationships too. So the way you view relationships and understand relationships shifts because you shift, right? You become and you learn how to be more mutual, more open because you know how to trust yourself. So when you enter into relationships, it's not that you're looking for someone to fill a void, because on your healing journey through the processing of that thing, you process your feelings, you process your emotions, and so therefore you don't need anyone else to come and fill a void or emptiness within you because you are learning how to fill it yourself, right? And that's the good news, right? And so it's not based off of a need to feel completed because you're learning in this process how to complete yourself, how to love yourself, how to value yourself, how to give yourself what you need rather than trying to get it from someone else, right? And so when we go through the process and we process our emotional scars, we're able to develop our authentic self and walk in it unapologetically, right? Because we're recognizing that all of our experiences impact who we are. So we no longer have to cover up or hide our experiences of trauma or shame and keep them in. Rather, we express them or process them in safe and sacred spaces, right? Because everyone cannot hold your story. So that's why it's important that you find safe and sacred spaces where you can process. No, it's not that you overcome the fear. No, let me say this correctly. You overcome the fear because you're able to recognize, okay, where is this coming from? And you process it. But the memory of the trauma doesn't go away. The difference is when you process your emotional scars, it's not keeping you bound, right? So the shame and the guilt that's attached to the emotional scarring no longer has power and control over you. And I think that's what gets us sometimes is because we don't process, we don't acknowledge, rather we suppress and not deal with. And what I'm encouraging us to do through this series of scars is to process, is to acknowledge, is to give voice to and to name, right? And I'm not saying go out in the streets and be loud and name it to everybody. No, I'm encouraging you to go and find a therapist that's able to hold your thick narrative, that's able to hold the weightiness of your emotional scars, right? And that's able to create a safe and sacred space for you to express, to explore, to process however you need to process. So for everybody, it's going to be different, right? And so when we do this, the shift is that we no longer live in the past. The past no longer has control over us. Will the memories ever go away? No. The difference is how we cope with the memory is different, right? So the memory of the trauma or the memory of the abuse or the memory of whatever the emotional scar is, it doesn't keep us bound, right? It's not allowing us to live in a state of fear or shame or guilt or unforgiveness because we've processed it. We've worked through it, right? We've named it. We've called it out. We're no longer internalizing it and keeping it in. Rather, we're externalizing it because we're getting it out of ourself, out of our being. And we are empowered and encouraged to process the pain, to process whatever comes up for you, right? And know that no, we cannot erase whatever emotional scars happen, but we do have the power to process and to work through them at our own pace in a safe and sacred space that allows our thick narrative in. Thank you for that. And so, another thing that when we look at reauthoring, it's about processing the emotional scars. It's about being able to develop an authentic self. It's about becoming free, going back to that the experience or the traumas or the emotional scarring no longer keep us, and sometimes it keeps us because of the shame, because of the guilt, because of how we blame ourselves for something that we had no control over, right? And a lot of the emotional scarrings can come from the misuse of power, right? And so being able to be in a safe and sacred space, that therapeutic encounter, it allows you to process all that. It allows you to be reflective and to have some introspection so you can work through it. So you can see the experience for what it was, and you stop holding the blame of what happened to you and you place it on where it belongs, and that's on the perpetrator, or that's on whoever caused the emotional scarring and not you, right? And so it also helps us to develop our boundaries because we have to have healthy boundaries in place, right? And a lot of times we continue to experience or collect these emotional scars because there's a lack of boundaries, because of the pain or the trauma or the experience that happened to us in our past. We bring it in our present and we live through that, right? And so, because we live through it, we make choices based on that trauma, that pain, or that emotional scarring. And so, we may enter into relationships. It don't have to be just romantic. It could be platonic relationships, romantic relationships, relationships, right? That can continue to cause emotional scarring because we are seeking out or looking for this fulfillment because we have this internal void within us, right? And so boundaries help us to be accountable to ourselves, and we demand that same accountability from other people, right? Notice I said demand. But in order for us to demand someone to respect our boundaries, first we must respect our boundaries, right? We must be able to clarify what our boundaries are. Our boundaries help us to express our feelings, our values, our needs to ourselves, right? And they help us to have accountability, right? And when we know what that is, then we're able to communicate it to other people. They offer clear limits, right? So it's important that once we reauthor our story, that we continue to create clear and healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries assist us on the healing journey and becoming a healthier self because we're more aware now. We have this self awareness. And with that self awareness, we're able to set limits, right? Of who we choose or how we choose to enter into relationships and who we choose or allow into our space, right? And as we recap, all of this is dealing with strengthening. And so when we look at strengthening of emotional scars, again, it shifts us from victim to victorious because we are able to name, we are able to claim, we are able to honor and reauthor our story, right? You are not influenced by the scarring, rather, you begin to make meaning for yourself in spite of the emotional scarring. You shift from living in your past and you shift to a life that you desire, the future that you desire. So, how you embrace the good things in your life, how you show up for yourself in the present, right? Rather than continuing to drag the past with you into your present, right? You are able to see the emotional scarring as an event or events and no longer as your entire identity. And sometimes that is what keeps us stuck because we identify ourselves based on the trauma, based on the emotional scarring, based on the abandonment, based on the rejection, right? And so, what this does, it allows us to reauthor our story based on who we discover that we are, right? We're no longer living through the lens of the trauma, through the lens of the scarring, through the lens of the abandonment and rejection, right? How to process, to cope, to name, right? Us to a place where we are able to acknowledge what it is that we want, where we're able to acknowledge the pain and why it hurt, where we're able to acknowledge and give the responsibility of that trauma or that pain or that emotional hurt to the person that caused it. So we're no longer holding all of the weight. We're not holding it, and we're not being responsible for it, right? And a lot of times that's what holds us down because we take on the responsibility of what someone else did to us, right? And so if your emotional scarring is from when in your early childhood development, let's say you was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, how can you be responsible for someone that did something to you at that stage, right? And so this helps us to look and see the good within ourselves separate from the harm that was caused through the experience. Through processing our pain and acknowledging and honoring what we feel and what we think by lamenting, right? It shifts us to empower ourselves to see our resiliency. So you go from experiencing this thing at 12 and now you 50, right? So what have you used? What was in place to get you to this place, right? And so it may be that we was using A, B, C, and D, and that's not working anymore. So now we come to a place where we're seeking the help that we need. And that's when we find that safe and sacred therapeutic space where we can lament, where we can explore, where we can express our feelings in a safe and sacred space and process them, right? All of this allows us to expose the pain and expose the persons who caused us the pain in that therapeutic encounter, in that safe and sacred space, right? Leading us to accept ourselves even though we experience this emotional scarring, that does not define who we are. So we begin to see ourselves and our identity apart from the emotional scarring, right? And so, in this process, leading us to accept ourselves apart from the person or the trauma, the violence that created the emotional scarring, it's in the surrendering that helps us to release the hold of that narrative, right? And invites us to reauthor a new narrative informed and identified by us and not by someone who may have caused us pain or hurt. And so you release it and you are no longer bound by that shame and that guilt because in the process on this healing journey, you're learning how to forgive yourself. You're learning how to let go. And learning to let go and forgiveness is a very important part of the process in order to move us forward so we're not stuck in the past, right? And we're not living in a past state in our present, right? So forgiving yourself that permits you to move on and put the blame and accountability on the person or persons who caused the emotional scarring, shifting you from being accountable of what happened to you and releasing the need for them to be accountable for the actions or the harm that they did, right? And all of this takes place in a safe and sacred therapeutic encounter between you and a professional, right? Because that professional is going to be able to help you to process, right? And to deal with all of this and give you the resources and the tools that you need. So, helping you to explore positive attributes about yourself rather than only seeing or identifying yourself through the pain, which moves you to explore your resourcefulness. What have you been using that has kept you thus far, because you are resilient, because you're still here, right? You're able to assess your experiences from a different lens and reframe your experience, redefining it in order that it serves you and does not work against you. Through focusing on your positive attributes, the good enough that's already within you, right? And so you harness it differently through the reauthoring and the reframing. You harness the experience of the emotional scarring differently. You begin to see it differently. And you begin to see it differently. That's why it no longer has that same power and control over you that can keep you bound. And so you reframe the negative coping skills and you learn how to replace them with healthy coping skills. You shift from a place of despair to a place of hope. And you are encouraged to look forward to a future because you're choosing the type of future you want for yourself, meaning you're choosing who you are and what you want for yourself. You are spending time with yourself to get to know who you are. You are loving yourself, you are valuing yourself, and you are identifying who you are and recognizing that you are more than the experience of the scarring, right? And so reauthoring helps you to make meaning of your life. This is the source of strength, the source of life giving rather than life taking when we shift. And in closing, remember healing is available and it's possible even though we've experienced emotional scars. Strengthening helps us to shift the meaning of how we see the scars. You begin to embrace your beauty out of the ashes, out of the pain, right? You begin to see your beauty and your worth, and you see the past, you see past the shame and you see past the guilt, and you begin to see your strength and see that you are an overcomer and that you have survived it because you are an overcomer. And your emotional scars no longer disfigure you. So you don't see yourself from a place of disfigurement, rather from a place of beauty, right? And so strengthening pivots you towards self determination to reauthor a new narrative, shifting you to reframe from victim to victorious, developing a healthy psychological functioning, healthy emotional availability and vulnerability, resiliency, and yes, reauthoring, which allows the shift. And I know tonight we covered a lot, but I want to thank you for tuning in to our last series on scars, and everything that I shared in this series on emotional scarring came out of my research and my book, which is Midwifing, a Womanist Approach to Pastoral Counseling. And again, if you are in need of a therapist, you can visit me at drmyrna.com or you can go to psychologytoday.com. There are many, 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 many resources available to you based on your need. And again, if you have any questions, if I can support you in any way, don't hesitate to give me a call. You can email me also at transform@drmyrna.com. I want to thank you for taking the time out to tune in for this series. And our next series that we will begin, we will look at forgiveness and letting go. So you'll see that each series that we've gone through is kind of building upon the other. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time out to enter into this space to learn, and I pray that God continues to lead you on your journey of healing. And again, if I can be of assistance, if you have any questioning, you can always feel free to reach out to me at transform@drmyrna.com, or you can visit me at mhtfamilylifecenter.org, or give me a call at 770-468-7100. Thank you for tuning in, and you have a blessed weekend, and make sure you find some time to laugh and enjoy yourself. God bless.